Okay, so welcome everybody to this first and hopefully one of the last online versions of the Sky Talk series. Hope everybody is in good health, physical and mental. We are very pleased to have Abhishek there to talk about a very important topic, which is the mathematical modeling of COVID-19. So, for the very few who probably don't know Abhishek, Abhishek there is a faculty at ICT STIFR with an expertise in statistical mechanics. Recently, he's also been putting in effort to demystify some mathematical models, some demystify some of the things that it's promising just before it can affect one of the policymakers. So, without further ado, I welcome Abhishek to give the talk. Once again, before Abhishek starts, I request everyone to mute their microphones unless they want to ask a question. Thank you, Abhishek.
Okay, thanks, Vishal. First, I would like to thank.
Can you hear?
Can everyone hear? Yeah.
Can you hear?
Okay, so I just want to thank Vishal, Deep and Nava for asking me to give this talk. So, I mean, of course, I'm not I'm completely an outsider in this area, but because I had to give this talk, I really put in some effort and learned a lot. So I'm really thankful to them for asking me to talk.
Audio is not working.
It's not working. Abhishek,
Hello?
Sanjeev, we can hear everything, so it's probably at your end.
Hello? Yes.
Okay. So, I'll talk about like what can we learn from mathematical modeling, and so partly I'll talk a little bit about some work that we have done with Orgho, Shrashti and Anupam. And we also have been having a lot of discussions with Jitendra Kanaya and Sriram Shastri on this issue. So I want to thank them. Okay, so okay, let me. Okay, so here's the outline of the talk. So first, I want to give a warning that I have 2 months of experience in disease modeling. So I'll give a brief history of this field of epidemiology. And what exactly what are the really things we want to learn models to tell us, and give some examples of how they have been doing. In particular, I want to discuss a bit about this Imperial College model, which was is kind of famous in this recent past. And then I'll talk about this model called SIR, which is probably the simplest model of epidemiology. I'll try to explain the model and basically try to see what one can learn just from this very simple model. Okay, so and then I'll talk a little bit about our results, and also discuss some other very briefly discuss some other like studies from India. Okay, so okay, so this is a brief history one. So basically, so one of the earliest work was by Bernoulli. He wrote some sort of a logistic equation to understand smallpox inoculation data. And then there's some very interesting history about attempts by Ronald Ross. So he was in India, in Calcutta. He was a physician and studying malaria a lot. And he was really one of the first advocates of trying to understand disease transmission and control through mathematics. Okay? So the very fact that you can use mathematics, I mean, that it was like it appealed to him very strongly. And I found that there's a big kind of a report, a 760-page report called Prevention of Malaria. I mean, it's a fantastic work. I mean, containing detailed analysis of all sorts of data, and also attempts to understand basically this transmission of malaria by writing mathematical models. Okay, and so I mean, so as I will explain later, I mean, when we talk of models, I mean, there are two levels of modeling. one kind of ignores spatial information, and it's like you have a well mixed population. And then you might also want to include information about local, like geographical distribution and so on. Okay, so I mean, in 1910, actually Ronald Ross was already thinking of both these aspects. Okay, and in fact, he was looking at how mosquitoes spread, and he was one of the first person who really thought of the random walk model. And the story is that he talked to someone called Pearson, who was a mathematician. And then there's this famous story of Pearson writing an article in Nature, which posing a problem on random walks, like how do you solve this problem? And then Lord Rayleigh solved this problem. Okay, so this is very interesting history. And then if you look at Ronald Ross's work, basically some version of the SIR model already exists in his work. Okay, and so there's this article that someone wrote on Ronald Ross, where he says that, so what is the importance of modeling? I mean, during the early years of the century, Ross waged a constant and often acrimonious battle for the acceptance of what he called his mosquito theorem. The theorem is very simple. It just says that the mere reduction of mosquito populations in the field provided a means of preventing malaria transmission. Okay, so this was obvious to Ross, but not obvious to his contemporaries in the medical and public health professions. And this he wanted to make precise by using models. Okay, and then in around 27, there was this paper by Kermack and McKendrick, where these equations were formally written, and maybe this is the beginning of modeling in a very formal way. McKendrick was a collaborator of Ross, and both of them actually spent time a long time working in India. Okay, so now let's go to ask the basic question: what exactly do we want modeling to tell us? Okay, so I show some data from very recent data from COVID data from New York City. Okay, so the first plot it gives the data for the number of new cases recorded in New York City starting from 8th March and going on till 15th May. Okay, and so the first plot is daily new cases. The second plot is number of hospitalizations, daily hospitalizations, and the third plot is number of deaths. Okay, so the first plot, you see that it peaks at around maybe around 5th May, and the number of new cases every day is like 6,000. The number of hospitalizations is like 1,500, and the number of deaths is like 500. Okay, so this is so these are the numbers that you see in the data, and the most important questions that a model could do is to make predictions. For example, of like what is the this peak size, 6,000 new cases and 1,500 hospitalizations. I mean, can one predict these numbers from before? Right, so this of course is an obvious important question. If there are 1,500 daily hospitalizations, this means that like each person spends maybe 7 to 10 days in the hospital, so that would need like 15,000 hospital beds. If you think about Bangalore, hospital beds, and so I mean one needs to know this number. How bad can it get? Right, and then other questions are, I mean, when will this peak occur? And so, I mean, this thing could have gone on much longer. So, at what time do we expect it to turn around? So that's called flattening the peak and so on. Then we want to know how many people will die and how long will this last? And finally, what can interventions do? Right, so these are the sort of obvious questions that one would want a model to tell us. So let's see now what this famous Imperial College prediction did. So this is a model. It's a very sophisticated model with lots of details. There are details of the SIR model forms part of the input, but it takes data from various countries and does various sorts of extrapolation and so on. It's a very detailed study, okay, and it looks at it divides the population according to age and workplace and so on, and puts lots of connections and all. So it's a very detailed study. Now, what were the predictions that they made? And this was in March 16. What they predicted is, this is for Great Britain and US. If there was no interventions at all, then this is the first plot that you see. What you see is the deaths per day. Okay, and you see that this is for 100,000 per 100,000 of the population, and the peak is 20, which translates. This is for Great Britain. It's 20 per 100,000 population. Okay, so this translates to around 40,000 deaths per day in UK, and in US it translates to 50,000 deaths per day. Okay, and over the entire period, if you integrate this, the prediction was that almost 2 million people in the US would die. Okay. So this is a very hard prediction. I mean, obviously it scares people. And then they also made predictions of, like, if you do different mitigation strategies. So if you don't do a complete lockdown, but you kind of maybe isolate the old and vulnerable, and maybe close schools and universities, so do it at some partial level, then that's the second plot, various mitigation strategies. And what they found is, what they predicted is that maybe you can reduce things by a factor of 2, which is still very bad, right? So the conclusion was that you need a drastic lockdown. And of course, this paper had a huge impact. So before this paper, I mean, so this is in March 16th. Before this paper, UK had a policy of, they were not imposing a lockdown, and they were just trying what is called as mitigation, which means you just try to, the eventual aim is that you try to develop some sort of herd immunity. Okay, so this I will explain later what exactly herd immunity means.
One quick clarification. The Imperial College model is an agent-based model, right? It's not an SIR model at all, no? Or?
Okay, so when I looked at the paper, I see SIR. Agent-based models are stochastic versions of SIR. So in that sense, I'm just in a broad sense.
So the reason it was an agent-based model.
Yeah, it's an agent-based model, right? Yeah. But so SIR model, you can think of a stochastic version, and then you can think of local information, which makes it pretty much an agent-based model. Okay, and so then, of course, this prompted major policy change in UK, and also maybe it influenced the US government a bit. And this is finally what we see at present. This is the first plot, plots number of deaths that you see in US per day. And this is now peaked at 2,800 instead of 50,000 that you would have if you didn't do anything, or if you did with mitigation, right? If you just did mitigation. And UK is now, you can see peak at a much smaller value, like 1,200. So it's clearly, in this sense, if one believes that those predictions were true, this really changed things drastically. Okay, so now, so if you look at the prediction, this was a very broad prediction. Like, you don't, even if you don't trust the details, at least there's the overall message which you can take, and then you can decide on policy. Okay, and so one can ask, like, actually, how good are these things models at predicting? Okay. So this is some report that I found in from New York Times, where they compare different models in the US, which try to predict what the number of deaths. Okay, and so this black curve is the actual data till, let's say, till May 1. Okay, so this is, and then the different models. So this blue curve, this is the IHME. So this IHME is kind of one of the important important healthcare health institutes which advises the US government. At least it was advising till recently. And this is their prediction. And then there are the several other predictions which are which look very different. Okay, the Imperial College looks like this. And so it's clear that you can't really trust the numbers exactly. Okay, so if so 15th May is somewhere here, and the number then is like 1700 or deaths, which is close to these values. Okay, so they're not completely off, but it's not clear. For example, the IHME is completely wrong, the blue curve. And okay, so this is what one sees about how predictive they can be. Okay, this is again from this IHME. So IHME is Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. It's based at University of Washington in Seattle. And as I said, this is one of the main sources of that the US government uses. Okay, so here I show one of their predictions for daily counts, and this dotted line is their prediction of daily counts, and the orange line below is the actual counts. Okay, so this of course looks really bad. What they would say is that the model, because there are a large number of asymptomatic cases, people who don't show symptoms, and therefore tests don't, or there are insufficient tests, so they've never captured. So I mean, so therefore this doesn't give the correct count of cases. But if you look at deaths, then they can do some extrapolation which seems to predict the deaths more reliably. Okay. So, I mean, these are extremely complicated models, but one can see that it's not really, the predictive abilities may not be so great. Okay, so this is a very nice article that I found in this journal called The Atlantic, which basically say don't believe the COVID-19 models. That's not what they are for. Okay, so I mean, so it says the problem is sometimes people believe epidemiologists and then get mad when their models aren't crystal balls, and then they give this example of UK. So UK started by with the idea that if they let enough people get sick and recover from the mild version of the disease, they could create herd immunity. And then this Imperial College model changed things completely. So what this article says is that the most important function of this models is as a simulation, a way to see our potential futures ahead of time, and how that interacts with the choices we make today. Okay, so one should look for the broad message that these models give us, not really for the exact numbers. Okay, so now I'll talk a little bit about the simplest epidemiology model, which is this so-called SIR. Let me see time. Okay, so basically in its so I mean, if there are questions, please do ask, and maybe I'll wait for 30 seconds or 10 seconds.
So sorry, before you go into details, and since you ask for questions, I mean, what then does the model really tell you? I mean, as you say, the models you showed for the US, I think if you look at the data to May 20, they've all been falsified. The IHME model is very bad, but even the other models are not doing too well. So I mean, what is the model telling you that you couldn't get by just thinking about the problem a little bit? That's the question.
No, like if you look at the Imperial College prediction, they told you exactly what mitigation would do. That it would reduce the numbers by half at most.
But the Imperial College prediction is I mean, it's based on a counterfactual, so we don't know. I mean, what they were saying, but I mean, that's also something you would have got by just thinking about the problem, right? That you need to lock down.
No, I mean, how do you get any numbers? I mean, just by thinking.
No, you don't get numbers, but the numbers that the models are giving are not making any sense anyway, right? They're not matching the data. Or
no, but at least it tells you, like it tells you 2 million people dead, or what is the peak number of infections. I mean, that's good to know, right? I mean, to have some number is important.
Sorry, the question I'm asking is, do we have any example of a case where the model gives you a number that's actually reliable? I mean, no, I could
No,
come
the
up with
number
a
gives you the worst case scenario, right? So, I mean, in the Imperial College prediction, if you look at, it's the worst case scenario, and then you just act on it.
Okay, fine. We can come back to this in the end. But the question is, let's say there was a bug in the Imperial College model. It's an agent-based model, and there are even some claims by people who analyzed it that there might have been a bug. Just let me ask you a question. Let's say there was a bug, and actually the figure was 1 million or 3 million. The point is, we don't even know, right? These are just numbers in the air.
Right there. No, so this I'll come back at the end of the talk. I'll come back to this question. I mean, that's important, but yeah, I'll come back. Right. Yeah. Okay. So so the SIR model, I mean, in its simplest form, it considers a well-mixed population. So you don't care about who's where. Like the infected and the people who have maybe already have the infection and recovered, and then the susceptible, they are all mixed up, right? And also the numbers are kind of large, so you ignore statistical fluctuations, but you can also include them. But in the simplest version, we include fluctuations. Okay. So the model, let me just define. So consider a population of n individuals. As the disease spreads at any given time, one has 3 classes of people. S number of susceptible individuals who have not yet been infected. I infectious individuals. So these are people who can pass the infection to another if they come in contact. And R recovered or removed. Okay, so here in this R class, it includes people who have been, for example, are still infectious maybe, but are in hospital or in quarantine and so on. Okay, so that's the way I think about it. So removed might be a better word. They are not in the class of people who are passing around the infection. Okay, so these are the 3 class of people. And so the infectious people, if they come in contact with a susceptible person, then with some probability the infection passes to that person. And then you can ask, like, in a given day, how many contacts would that person typically have? So if you multiply the contacts by the probability of transmission during one contact, then it gives you the mean number of people who you infect in one day. Okay, so this number I will call beta. Okay. And so then, because there are S number of people who are not yet infected, so only a fraction n by n are susceptible. So the mean number of new infections per day is just beta times I times S by n. Okay, so this is the simple logic about how many new infection, from the population of size S, how many people get infected by I number of infectious people, okay, who are randomly moving around. So this number is beta IS by n. Beta is a parameter which is kind of, so there is a probability of transmission during one contact, which might be kind of intrinsic. And there is number of contacts per day, which of course depends on various other factors. Okay, so so that's how the infection spreads. And then the other parameter in the model is like how long does a person stay infectious. Okay, so so given maybe you for T days you're infectious, and then you kind of are either quarantined or hospitalized, or you die or whatever. So the T is the time scale over which you pass the infection, right? So the transition from I to R therefore takes place at a rate 1 over T. So that's the rate of recovery. So there are these 2 more parameters, beta and gamma, and then there's the population size n, and we can basically write how things then change with time. Okay, so this is a sort of a cartoon of what happens. So if you look at this, you start with a population of 50 yellow people who are all susceptible, and 1 infectious guy, and then maybe 2 other people get infected, and then maybe 3 other people get infected and 1 person recovers. This the blue guy has recovered, and so on. And finally, of course, you end up with like you just have a bunch of people who have recovered, and are immune to the disease. That's an assumption. And then there's this class of susceptible. Okay. So at the end of the day, you might, I mean, not everyone will get infected. There are some people, because there's this sea of immune people who kind of protect you from getting into contact with the infected people. So you'll have some final steady state which looks like this. Okay, so then you write some equations, and so this is what the dynamics looks like. You have a susceptible population S. With some rate, these numbers decrease and become infected. And then these infected numbers are removed at this rate gamma I. So these are the basic SIR equations. These are 3 equations for the 3 population changes. Okay, and so so it's easy to run this on a computer, and let's say, so here I showed some data for a population of size 10 to the power 5, where initially you just start with one infected guy. So the green is the susceptible class. Initially everyone is susceptible, and you start with one infected guy, and this is the red curve is the infectious population. So it grows at some time after 60 days, maybe there are 20,000 infected people, and then it slowly dies down. The disease is over around this time. And the total number is this blue curve, which is just the total area under this curve is this blue curve. Right, so that's the total number who have got infected, and at the end it saturates to some number which tells you like what fraction of the population got affected, and these people are now immune to the disease. Okay, so in this, if you do this simple example, so here the parameters that I chose are kind of I mean typical of what you see for COVID. Beta is like 0.34 and gamma is like 1/7. So and this R0, which I'll explain later, it's called the reproductive number. It's given by this ratio of beta over gamma. It's 2.4, and this number mu, which tells how fast the disease grows, is the exponential growth rate. For this particular choice of parameters is 0.2. Okay, so now. So we see that this peak occurs at the peak value of infections is like infections is 3,000, and the final fraction of infected people is 88%. And even if you take this simple model and assume that 1% people of this infected people die, you actually get very close to the Imperial College predictions. Okay, so in some sense, you can, from a simple model, you can get predictions that much more complicated models give.
Sorry, Abhishek, just this 1% is almost guaranteed, right? Because in this, as you said, about 88% are going to, you know, it's basically assuming that a very substantial fraction of the population will get infected, and then the 1% will just come about, right? But there are other predictions.
No, but sorry, this 1% is independent of this 88%.
I know, but the final figure of 2 million, that's basically like 2/3% of the US population,
Right, yeah.
So I mean,
sorry, 2 million is, sorry, 2 million is much less than 2/3.
No, 2/3%, 0.6%.
Oh, 2/3, right, yeah, something like that, right, yeah. Yeah, you could just get it from this number.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so, right. But what this model could not tell you maybe more very accurately is what mitigation strategies would have done, which perhaps you need a more detailed study. Okay, so that's what I think is possible. Okay, so now let me just talk about some terms that you probably keep seeing in the newspapers. One is this reproductive number R0. So this is just the mean number of people that one infectious person directly infects, like during the time he is infectious, right? So earlier I defined beta is the number of people you infect per day, and then the disease lasts for a period time t, which is inverse of gamma. So therefore, the number of people you infect in your in the time you're infectious is basically beta by gamma for this model. Okay, so if you look at in the literature, I mean, this value of the reproductive number varies anywhere between 2 to 6. So, I mean, this of course is an important number, because if it's greater than 1, then the disease will spread. If it's less than 1, it dies down, right? Because one person, if he infects less than 1, then things just die down. Okay, so so this is one important characterization of the disease. And then you keep hearing about this doubling time, and one might wonder how is it related to this reproductive number. So okay, so what one can see from the SIR model is that the model tells you that initially, when the number of infections is very small compared to the population size, then this number will grow exponentially. And then you can ask, like, when is it double? And if you know this exponent mu, then you know that it doubles after some time. Okay, so this is the time for number of infections to double. And so what is the relation between R0 and the doubling time? So in this particular model, what is true very generally is that if R0 is greater than 1, then this exponent mu is greater than 0 and the disease grows. While if it's less than 1, then the disease dies down. If for this SI type models, you can prove that this mu is beta minus gamma. So it's not exactly, it depends not just on R0, but also on other parameters, right? So in this case, it depends on gamma. It's basically given by this formula. Okay, so one point is that this reproductive number does not fix the doubling time. Okay, so one question that might come when in the news you all keep seeing someone predicted that the reproductive number today is 1.4 or something. Where does this come from, right? So that's one sort of question. And in fact, this number is, to just calculate this number requires a model. Okay, so I mean, if you look at how people have estimated reproductive numbers, you could do contact tracing and find out actually how many people this one person infected, but that's kind of not always done. Like I looked at many papers, and it seems typically there's a model behind this estimation of R0. Okay, now what is herd immunity? So herd immunity is basically if there are enough people who are immunized, then these immunized people kind of form a shield for the disease, and it just can't spread. Okay, so if you ask one person, it typically infects R0 into S by N. So if this is less than 1, then of course the disease can't grow. Okay, so this is assuming that there are S infected people and just one infectious people. You ask whether it grows or not, then you can easily convince yourself that I mean, you need this to be less than 1, then the disease doesn't spread. Okay, so this tells us that if a fraction of population, which is 1 minus 1 over R0, has recovered or is immunized, then the disease is controlled. Okay, so for when I took, if R0 is around 2, then this is around 75%. You'll notice that if you let the disease run freely, it actually reaches like close to 90%. Okay, so so this is different from because you don't start with just one infected person. Yeah.
Okay. Why do you write RC by N? You just mean RC, no?
So this is the fraction of population.
RC is already a fraction, no? So why are you dividing by N?
RC is the actual number.
No, okay, that's not how you've written it, but anyway.
Sorry, what did I write? I mean,
RC,
you defined RC just as the fraction of the number.
Right. Yeah. Right. So RC here is the number of recovered individuals.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah, it's number.
Right. So RC by N is basically the critical fraction of recovered individuals. That's what you have, right? Recovered,
yeah.
or whatever you call them.
Right. Yeah.
RC is a fraction, so you shouldn't have the 1 over N, I guess. That's all.
No. So I think the way he's representing it, RC is not a fraction.
So that's
Because
just my
n plus
definition,
r is
right?
equal to
Okay.
n.
Oh, sorry,
N is-
sorry. It does. So if if I call it fraction, oh, sorry, I define it as fraction. Sorry, yeah. So okay, that's bad notation. RC should, there's no n here, right? Yeah.
Wait, sorry, I'm confused now because you have S plus R is equal to N, right? N is the total number of people in the population.
Yeah, no, let me just,
Right. So R there is not a fraction. R is actually the number of. Right. So
Right, so
RC
let's
here also presumably
No,
the
but,
number and not a fraction.
So,
Yeah, so let
Bruto,
me
the
just
thing
make
is,
the
he's
statement.
using R for recovered persons where it's extensive, and he's also using R for this R0, which is an
Right. So I
intensive
think
number.
that's one source
So
of
this
confusion, that
RC
the
is,
same letter R is there, to represent the number of recovered individuals, and is also in R naught.
Okay,
So-
let me just clarify.
So here, then it
Let
depends
me
on
just clarify.
which way you lean, whether you want it extensive or a fraction. But he has
No,
written
let me just clarify,
fraction
right?
of immunized persons. So
Yeah, so
the
so
sentence it says fraction.
let's say we stick to the notation that RC is the fraction, then I should not have this n in the equation. So it's just RC equals to 1 minus R 1 by R naught, and RC is this capital R divided by n, where R is the actual number. Okay, and R naught is the reproductive number. It has nothing to do with this R. Okay, it's this is a standard notation that everyone uses, but it does cause confusion. But I hope it's
Standard
clear.
bad notation.
Yeah, it's bad notation. Right, but I hope this is clear now. So that n should not be there, and RC is a fraction. Okay, so. Right. So these are things we can already see in this SIR model, and one has a clear idea what exactly they mean and so on. Now, the other thing that would really want to do is how to introduce interventions in the SIR model. So what is the purpose of interventions? And here I'm talking about non-clinical interventions, which are not related to like developing vaccines and so on. So in that case, so basically what we want to do is we want to change the value of R naught to a new value. Let's call it R naught target, which is less than 1. Okay, so if R naught is greater than 1, it blows up, and we want to somehow make it less than 1. Okay, so now we recall that R naught is given by this ratio beta by gamma. Beta is kind of like depends on contact, like person-to-person contacts and how it moves. And then there's this parameter gamma, which is the rate at which things move out of the infectious population. Okay, so from this relation, we can see that there are two ways you can control the disease. One is by social distancing, which means that you reduce beta, right? Because beta depends on the number of contacts an infectious person has per day. And if you reduce social distancing, basically decreases beta. And the other way you can change is, okay, so what does testing quarantining do? Okay, so what testing quarantining, you can imagine what it does is you test people, and if they're infectious, you remove them, right? You quarantine them. So you remove people from the infectious pool of infectious people. So, so therefore, in some ways, it's changing gamma, right? So, so I've shown it pictorially. So this is the original SIR model, and now what you have done is you have introduced a parameter U, which is a prefactor of beta, which tells you about the level of contacting. So this is the social distancing parameter in the model now. And then because of testing and quarantining, you are removing people from this infectious population with some additional rate, right? So therefore, you have changed gamma to, let's say, gamma plus R, and you have changed beta to beta U. And in both cases, either increasing gamma or decreasing beta basically causes a reduction in R naught. Right. So this is what.
Right. Abhishek,
Yeah.
But what about things like washing your hands and wearing a mask, right? Because those things should also reduce beta finally, in the sense that they're not reducing the number of contacts that you have, but they're reducing the number of contacts that lead to infections, right?
Yeah. So that also.
I mean, the fraction of contacts which are leading to infections. So,
right,
so
yeah.
that's also presumably there in the model.
That also is included in beta, right? Yeah.
Yeah, he had
I
something
guess
called the
that's
probability of
that's part of
infection.
the social distancing also, right? Wearing a mask.
No. Actually, in the SIR model,
Well, I
Abhishek,
mean,
a probability of infection, and that now I think your washing hands and all probably reduce that.
right, we'll
Beta
decrease
was
that.
beta was number of contacts into probability of infection. So
Right.
beta is reducing. I mean, the washing hands is reducing that.
Yeah, it's part of you, no?
Right. Yeah. It's essentially it's part of you.
Right.
Right. Okay. And yeah. And then so these are two different very testing, quarantining and quarantining and social distancing are get into the model in different ways. That's what I want to say. And then of course you can run your model after including this. Okay. So let me just show you some data that you can generate again from these simple equations. And I'll discuss two different interventions. One is what I would call strong intervention, where you manage to reduce the reproductive number from let's say 2.44 was the free value, and you reduce it somehow to 0.8. Okay, so this is strong intervention. And if you look at the number of infections, what you find is that so what is the intervention factor? So what I did, what you see here is the blue curve out here. This U factor is like 1/3. Okay, so you kind of reduced contacts by a factor of 3. Or the green curve is where you just do a lot of testing at a rate which is like twice the rate at which normally people recover. Okay, so twice gamma. So the reason I chose these particular parameters is that both of them lead to the same value of R0 target. Okay, so both these intervention strategies lead to the same value of R0 target. And what we see is that, okay, so this red curve is with no interventions. There the peak was around 20,000, and this has now reduced to like 200. Okay, so just like, so this model tells you that if you reduce contacts by a factor of 3, then this peak number of infections goes down by a factor of 100. So that's what you get. On the right hand side, I plot the same data in log scale so that you can see all the 3 curves. And one other interesting feature is that after intervention, so here the intervention happened around maybe around the 3rd week or something. And then it took some time for implementation. And after it reaches the peak, then it again decays exponentially. There's an exponential decay. Okay, and this one can understand because everything is controlled by the linear dynamics. The numbers are so small that you can just linearize the equations, and the largest eigenvalue just tells you everything. Okay, so once you put in control, the largest eigenvalue is negative, and it gives you these decays. And one interesting point is that these decay strengths are different depending on how you impose interventions. Okay, so that's something that is interesting qualitatively, that different control schemes can give you different rates of decay. The other interventions.
One question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in all of these, but the number of immunized people, which was one of these curves which you were plotting initially, number of immunized people for the herd immunity which you were showing at some point, they are how does that number change depending on the value of the intervention which you have done?
See, right now I'm working with a population which has no immunity at all. Right, and the number we are looking at a time where the number of affected people is so small that they don't change the population at all. Right, so I mean this immunity can be completely neglected at this time scales.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So this is what I discussed about strong intervention. Now, supposing your intervention is not so good and you achieve a R0 target of 1.2. Okay, so then the disease is still growing, and then what do you expect? Okay, so this is what happens. So this is what one would say is like if you are just aiming at mitigation and not like complete control. So in this case, what you find is that the peak, so this is the red curve is the, without any intervention, that peaked at like 20,000 for a population of 100,000. And if you have achieved this 1.2, then you can see that the numbers are like less by a factor of 10. Okay, so instead of factor of 100, it's now a factor of 10. And then you can ask, like, eventually how many people get affected. So in for strong intervention, the number of affected people is finally very small. It's like maybe 1%. If you do a weak intervention, then maybe 10 or 20% of the population will eventually be affected. So here it's like 30%, more than 30% of the population. This blue and green curves indicate the final fraction, right? So total population is 100,000 and this is 30,000. So 30% of the population is finally affected. Okay, so this is if you do weak intervention, and and these peaks are quite large. Okay, so I mean these numbers. Okay, so now let's. I'll quickly show some. Okay, how much am I doing with time? Okay. Vishwada, I mean, how much time do I have?
The original idea was to go up till 6:40 and then open up for questions. But if you need a few more minutes, I'm sure that's okay.
Okay, 6:40 is good. Okay. Okay, so now this is what we see in the just this very simple model. Just now, let's just look at data and see if we see any of these features. Okay, so I'll show some data for that we look at, and this is the number of new cases reported in 6 countries. So the first 3 are like Germany, Spain, and Italy. And what you see is that initially there's and this is a log linear plot, and you see initially there's a rapid rise and then there's a slower decay. Okay, so one can conclude that these are the 3 cases intervention has succeeded. So this vertical line is around the time roughly where people imposed lockdowns and so on. And you can see that there's this roughly exponential decay in all these 3 cases, but a very slow decay. Okay, so you can see that even if you look at the numbers of new cases in Italy and so on, it's still close to 1,000, right? So it's still decaying very slowly. On the other hand, in these 3 other countries, India, Brazil, and Russia, it seems that intervention has been kind of weak. And so it's still kind of increasing, right? So right, so this is roughly what the model shows. So at least qualitatively, there's some agreement and there's some understanding. Okay, so one other thing that we looked at in our work is, like, is there some way to compare different countries and so on, right? So if we just look at new cases in, let's say, like 10 different countries as per day, then it looks like this. It's very different. So how do you normalize all these different things? So one normalization is just by population. You divide by the total population. And the second normalization that you have to do is that after you normalize the normalized fraction has to be shifted in time so that it starts at the same value of time. So if you do this, then what you find is that many of the European countries kind of fall. Okay, it's not really a collapse, but have some common, are kind of close. On the other hand, if you look at India, Pakistan, and Indonesia, they look very different. The green curve is South Korea is also very different. But in particular, India, Pakistan, and Indonesia look very different. Okay, so which is,
I'm not able to make out the difference between India and Pakistan. They're both light green, or?
So India, okay, so because of the way things are normalized, I mean, India stops. Okay, so let me try to. Can you see now?
Yes, thank you.
India kind of stops here. Okay, so India kind of actually it follows very close to Pakistan and then stops here because of the way we have shifted time.
Thank you.
Is that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so one thing it also tells us is that I mean, ideally one would have liked to use the experience from all these European countries who have already crossed the peak to see what one can learn. But because their trajectories look so different, it's not clear that it's not so direct. Okay, so I think I won't spend too much time, but I'll just briefly tell you what we attempted. So we studied something called SEIR model. So one includes a new class to just include the fact that when you get infected, for some time you're not infectious. Okay, so you carry the germ, but you can't pass it. Okay, so there's a period of time called the latency period for which you can't infect others. Okay, so that's the additional input in this model. And then the other input that seems important right now is that there is a large number of people who are asymptomatic, which means they either develop very weak symptoms or never develop any symptoms. Okay, so then you include additional classes in this model, and we have like 8 variables in just to take into account all that.
I had a question.
Yeah.
These people who are asymptomatic, but you still assume that they are able to infect others in the same way, or?
No, so we put a lower infectivity for them.
Okay, fine.
Right. There's both gamma and beta are different. Okay, so they stay less time in the infectious period stage, and they infect others with lesser probability. Okay, and then what we did is we studied these different interventions, strong interventions, weak interventions, and then for the case of weak intervention, actually there's some nice results we can. So these are, I mean, it's good to have some for example, I talked about the herd immunity. It just depends on R naught, right? So it just tells you that it's a very simple and nice result. So are there some such results one can find for the peak number of infections? What is the time it takes to reach this peak, and what is the total number? And such results did exist for SIR in the mathematical literature. And in our paper, what we have tried to propose similar relations for all this more complicated model. In some cases, they're not exact, but they seem to work extremely well. Okay, so these are probably useful relations which tell you some important qualitative numbers without doing a detailed simulation. Okay, the other thing that we tried to address is like how much testing is required, right? So we know that testing should be improved. And what we argued in this work is that what is important is to look at the number of tests per detected case in India. Okay, so this is a number that for example, ICMR keeps quoting. Right now, this number is 25, which looks large, right? So this is let's say per day you do so many tests, and you detect so many people, right? So and then per detected case, how many tests have you done? Okay, so it seems a large number, like 25 tests per detected person. So so what we try to argue is that it should be actually close. If it's maybe 100, it might start working better. Okay, so this is a very heuristic argument, but so I won't have time to explain it. Okay, and then there's something related to one question about what do different initial conditions do, and what we show is that they pretty much lead to the same solution up to some temporal shifts. So initial conditions don't really matter so much.
Vijay, I have a question. See, these models, these are like a kind of, I mean, how do you distinguish between 25 and 100? Because it doesn't give anyway accurate numbers, right? I mean, so how do you say that 100 is better than 25? I mean, I could have said that it's 150 or 200 or.
Right. So in the model, we have this parameter. We said that testing quantity changes gamma, right?
Yeah.
So now we ask, like, given everything, if we put some value of gamma, so we try to relate this gamma to this testing ratio. Okay. So then you can see that the rate of testing has to match the usual gamma, right? Otherwise, it won't make any effect. And then you can see that, if you just do some heuristic calculations, you can see that, so this just depends on like typically infected person. How many people, how many contacts does he make per day? Okay, so this again is related to this number of contacts. And if you just use some numbers there, like realistic numbers, you get this 100. So it's 100 is just a random number, but it's usually between 100 to 200 would be good. But of course, it's difficult to implement these things. But this is what at least the simple model shows.
So, but Abhishek, Sanjeev is right? Because if it was 400 instead of 100, that would make that sounds like a factor of 4, but it would mean you need to do 1 million tests a day.
But that's beyond something, it won't be practical. So one has to do what is practical.
I understand, but where does so the question is what is the meaning of the number really? Can I say there will also be local factors, right? There might be localities where a person has contact with more people. Localities.
So this has to be. One thing we point out is that you can't do random testing. It has to be based on contact tracing.
Right, but still, if you could explain where the 100 comes from and why the 100 is, why 100 and why not 200? It's a. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we come back to this later because this will. It just comes from like if you let's say you have one infected person. He was infectious, let's say for some time inverse of gamma. Right. In this time period, how many people did he meet? Okay. Now, if you can estimate that pretty much tells you how many tests you have to do per detected person. So it's a very simple argument. It's very heuristic. It may be wrong even, but it's the best. This is the only. You have to make some argument, right? You have to tell the government how much testing has to be done.
Right.
You can't just say more and more.
Right. Abhishek, so this number 100 that you get, how much does that depend on the fact that you're using an SEIR model? For instance, if you'd used an SIR model, would you have come to the same conclusion that you need 100 instead of, or does that depend on the number of compartments that you put in and also, the values of the parameters that you're choosing? Because the more compartments you have, the more parameters there are in your model, right? So how sensitive?
So see, so some of the interesting things are, for example, this R0. It is very insensitive to lots of other, like it doesn't depend on this extra compartment E. So the value of R0 is kind of completely independent of.
Right. But I'm assuming that this factor of 100 that you're getting is not just coming from the value of R0, right? It would also.
No, but I think the E doesn't make a difference in the argument. Okay. It's just the amount of time you were infectious, which is inverse gamma, right? It doesn't like E is basically the time you were not.
But the point is that in your SEIR model, you have another time scale, right? Which is the amount of time for which you were exposed.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So then because in that time period, you are not infecting anyone, right?
Right. So my question is this number 100 that you're getting, right? Yeah. Would you have the same number 100, for instance, if let's say you had an SIR model with just one time scale and R0, as opposed to an SEIR model in which you have, say, R0 and maybe 2 time scales, right? Does this number 100 depend on all of that, or is it insensitive?
Right. Yeah. At the level of our argument, it doesn't depend on these other time scales.
Right.
Abhishek, you should go on. But the question is, if it's more dangerous to give a number or just not to give a number at all. You see, one policy could be that let's some health worker appears and then makes a decision on how many people to test. So if a person has had contact with a lot of people, that health worker goes beyond 100, and if the person has not had contact with so many, maybe the person tests only 10 contacts. So it sounds to me like that might be the question is you can say that one needs to give a number, but giving a misleading number might actually be worse.
So this is a mean number, right? We are not. Of course, it has to be local. It has to be, but the mean number is what everyone quotes, and maybe it's possible that the mean doesn't mean anything. But this is something we are not sure actually, that whether we should give a number or not.
Sorry, can you include contact tracing in your model?
It's no, as such, it's not there. It's just introduced in the heuristic argument that goes. So basic point
but
is
that
if you
might
do
be
random
interesting to
testing,
introduce that, because if you say
yeah.
you trace the contacts and then with some probability you actually able to detect
yeah,
the
that would
people that
probably
you
need
are in
something
contact
like,
with, and then about the testing, how it affects the thing.
right. I think this
Whether
is
you
something that
tested, suppose you test all the people that the person is detected to be in contact with, then
right, yeah.
what happens?
Yeah, so this is something that the agent-based models can do, I think, where they would really be, they're really required.
This might be particularly important in this circumstance where the you remain in the exposed state for a long time. So the incubation period is quite long in this particular disease. So contact tracing may be important.
Right, yeah. Is that Rajesh?
Yes, it's Rajesh.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I guess this is like the type of models that you guys do. We will really be able to address this issue in a more sophisticated way. Okay, so so this is roughly what we did. Okay, so this is just I mean some data about this number of tests per confirmed case. That these are just some numbers that you can get from the data sites. So what you can see is that India is like for a long time it has on 8th April and 9th May the number hasn't changed. It's around 25. Like South Korea has a huge number. It's like maybe 500 or something. But other countries, a lot of other countries are quite small. Okay, like Switzerland and Italy, they're actually much smaller than India. But then you should also look at in time. I mean, how this has evolved. And in some countries, they start at early times. They started really very high testing, like test numbers. And that might have helped, right? Because see, once you are at a late stage, then there's community spreading, and then contact tracing won't help so much. So, so this testing really works at an early stage. So I think in some places in India maybe it works. Now in other places it may not work so well. Okay, so this is what I talked about, the heuristic estimates. Like we have some very simple formulas that tell you what is the peak height. So this is the formula for peak height. It involves the reproductive number in some way, and then the sigma is basically it's related to the time you spend in the exposed state, and gamma is the time you spend in the infectious state. So this factor basically pretty much tells you what is the peak number of infections. And for example, if you put R0 is 1.1 and mu is 0.05, which hopefully maybe is the case in India right now. I mean, R0 might be larger, in which case, and this exponent, of course, we can see in the data. It's like it corresponds to a doubling time of maybe to 12 days or something. And this R0 value is okay. You see values like 1.2 and so on in the newspapers.
There's a minus sign in the Abhishek.
Sorry?
In the expression IM, it's minus sign, 1 minus 1 plus.
Yeah, so this should be a minus here. Sorry, yeah. So this should be a minus here. Okay, so if you use these numbers, you get like 3.003. This is a fraction. And for India, this would translate to 3 lakh new cases per day. And then if you do some heuristics, this tells you eventually that at the peak time, when the disease has peaked, there will be like 1,000 deaths per day. Okay, so if we just let things go the way it's going now, and if we believe this model, this is what you get. And then you can ask, when will the peak be reached? This would be around, it would take around 6 months. So this you can, again, it's a simple argument. And then you can ask how many people, what fraction of the population is eventually affected. This would be about 17% of the population. Okay, so, right, yeah. So eventually you would have like 5 lakh deaths, but this is over a period of more than a year, right? So even though it looks like a big number, maybe it's not huge, but it's if you look at this number, like 10,000 hospital beds per day across India, I mean, then one can get some idea of what this means.
But Abhishek, this is very sensitive to this R0 of 1.1 that you chose, right? Which is
if you change R0 to if you change R0, okay, so maybe I have some plot here. Okay, so here I looked at various possibilities of changing R0 and so on, the initial R0 and the final R0 and so on. But the numbers you will get will be similar. Okay, so it won't change by, so instead of 2 lakhs, maybe it's 1.5 lakhs.
I mean, if R0 was 2, for instance, then 50% of the more than 50% of the population would get affected. You know, the initial value.
R0 is even if it's 1.4.
I was saying if it was 2, for instance, which is what they were talking about, which was the pre-lockdown value, maybe.
Yeah, then maybe close to 80% of the population would
get affected. Right, that's right.
Right, yeah.
So it depends very sensitively on what the value of R0 is, whether it's 1.1 or 1.4.
Right, yeah, but I'm taking a good case, right? I'm just taking like, so I'm taking I'm trying to find the lower and upper bounds maybe.
Okay.
I mean, R0 1.1 is like, looks like a good case. I mean, like if we have managed, because it's still increasing and maybe it's 1.1, then you immediately get some numbers, right? I mean, okay.
But it's 1.1 because of the lockdown, right? The moment.
Yeah, this is post-lockdown. So this is like before lockdown, you have some value. So here what I show is like different parameter sets where initial R0 might be 3.76 and after lockdown maybe 1.7.
Right.
Initial might be 2.63 and after lockdown might be 1.4.
Right. So in your calculation, you're assuming that you have an R0 of 1.1 for a period of at least 6 months or something, right? Which is
in this calculation.
The one which you had here. I mean, when will the peak be reached? It will be reached in 6 months' time, assuming that R0 remains 1.1 throughout.
Yeah, right? yeah. I mean, if you,
so which means that you're sort of talking about a pretty harsh lockdown for a period of 6 months.
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, so but let's say, yeah, it looks like pretty much. I mean, it's not as harsh as you want because you want it to make it even less than 1, but.
Right. But you know, whatever it is right now with the lockdown that's been imposed, the same intensity of lockdown in some sense has to continue for 6 months for you know what you have on the screen to happen. Is that correct?
Yeah. For I mean, So when so if you see like intervention.
Fine. I mean, I just want.
Right. So here, let's say intervention happened somewhere around this time at and then you let this go on for like 6 months or even more. You continue at the same level of social distancing and so on. In that case, you get this sort of a peak. Okay, so it's, I mean, it looks very difficult if this is true. Yeah, right, yeah. So this I'm just showing some data feed. So this I'm not very, I think it's not like you can fit with lots of parameters but maybe the final outcomes are not so drastically different. Right, but at least this, if you just feed the present data and continue, this is what you get from this model. Okay, so I just
so just one thing. I mean, as maybe Shubhrata was also saying, the initial. I mean, I was trying to ask earlier. The initial epidemiological values of R0 they estimated without social distancing were more like 2 or 3, right, from China before the lockdown there. And so, if one was to take that value, then the result would be very different for India, right? You would be estimating like 1 billion total infections almost.
No, that is, if you don't do anything.
Right, but you know, presumably the lockdown is already easing, and so we'll have to go back to the pre-lockdown value in some time. I mean, then there'll be masks and social distancing and something. But for instance, here you don't have anywhere a value of R0 anywhere near 2. And that
2.63 is there. I mean, like 2.63 is. I mean, it could be that's.
No, but after intervention, you've made it 1.41.
Right. Yeah. So if you go back to the 2.2, like 2 value, then I mean, then it will be. Then it's going to be very bad. But that's true for almost any country, not just India. If you lift, if you go back to if you lift the lockdown and go back to complete normal state, then there's going to be this what is called the second wave, and you're going to get exactly where you would have gone if you didn't do nothing from the beginning.
Okay, thank you. But I agree with you. But now I just want to point out in the picture where you had R0 equal to 1.1. After the infection dies down, if you go back to normalcy, you will even then get a second wave right after October, because the infections will not realistically go down to 0. So anytime you reach normalcy, you're going to reach that.
You can go to 0. I mean, in principle, like it takes a long time, right? Here it takes
right.
like
right. So actually, the infections don't really have to go down to 0. If they go down to a value required for herd immunity for the unmitigated R0, then even when you relax the lockdown, you will still have a decrease in the number of cases. But I guess with R0 equal to 1, right? But I guess with R0 equal to 1.1, that's unlikely to happen.
Yeah, you don't attain herd immunity at the end of the day.
Right,
exactly.
right. Herd immunity for R0 equal to 2.5.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
So for that, 1 billion people have to get the infection in India, right?
For that, no, yeah, I mean, but yeah, no. So what, like 2.2 would give you maybe
80%, right?
80%, right? Something like 80%.
So something like a bit. I mean, okay,
yeah,
immunity is lower, but with the overshoot, it's more like 80%, right?
Right. Yeah.
So okay, so those numbers are very different. So,
right,
so actually, this 1.1 is assuming not only a lockdown till October, but actually an indefinite lockdown, so the infection never rises, right? A lockdown till the vaccine comes. That's when you get the
yeah. So that, I mean, so if you, I mean, if you really believe this is what's going to happen.
Okay.
Okay. So then what? Yeah. So I just want to talk a little bit about some other work based which have looked at the Indian situation. So this one study is by a set of people mostly in the US, and maybe there are a few people from Delhi University. This first paper, and they again look at SIR kind of models and analyze different intervention outcomes and give some numbers. Then this is the this INSKI simulations, which is it's a SEIR type model, but with more compartments and information about for example, state-wise information and how these are connected and migration and so on. So I think they basically examine again different intervention schemes, and so some of their predictions again it seems you need more testing and this contact tracing, and they again predict a second wave. And then this is the third is work by people in ISC and TIFR, and this is I think probably one of the few agent-based studies in India. And they look at just 2 cities, I think right now maybe 2 more cities, but just Bombay and Bangalore, and use very detailed information on like wards and all, and then they also compare different lockdown schemes, and so they have like more detailed predictions for these cities, and like what is the number of hospital beds and so on. And they again predict this second wave if as soon as you lift the lockdown. Okay, so this is from this CDDPEP group. It's a study which got a lot of press coverage, and it predicted like 100 million infections. And I mean, I wrote to them asking for a report, and they said they're writing, but it never came. So it's highly unreliable. And then there's this so-called Cambridge model, which also got a lot of like press coverage. One of the good things it did was it looked at this age structured interaction. So it's again a SIR type model with more details. And it sort of predicted that the pandemic would end in 2 months. But what they did was basically in their model, they switch off interactions completely between people except within households, okay, which is a very strong and not the correct assumption. Unfortunately, from ICMR, it's difficult to find, they seem to be doing something, but it's difficult to find scientific reports. At least if I do a Google search, I can't find anything. And the other thing maybe people know, like what about other like public health and epidemiology departments in India? I mean, how come we don't see any studies from these groups? Okay, so at least it's we don't see. Maybe it's there, but it's not neither in the press nor one hears about them. So finally, one question is: are these studies influencing government policy in India? So many of these studies are sometimes widely discussed in the news and social media. But what about the government? I mean, it's not clear if like people making policy are looking at these studies, and probably one needs more specific recommendations which can be implemented. And I mean, when I talk to people, it seems like directly coordinating with policymakers is required, but it's kind of difficult. And finally, I mean, it's clear that whatever intervention should be based on inputs from science. And maybe this is happening, but one doesn't get this information. So it's not clear that, I mean, these inputs that the scientists are giving to the government, it's not clear that they're not made public. Okay? So at least one doesn't know how the government is taking its decisions. Okay, so finally, I think what use is modeling. I think it gives us a precise language and helps in formalizing and making rigorous of our intuition. And one should look for important qualitative messages rather than precise predictions. For example, I mean, in the SIR model, I mean, just the fact that reducing social contacts by a factor of 3 reduces peak infection number by a factor of 100. It's, I mean, it would be difficult to guess without a model. Yeah, maybe Subrat will differ in this. Okay, models can give us some rough idea about the possible outcomes of different policy actions, and especially of worst case scenarios. Okay, so this is good to know, like they tell us what are the worst case scenarios. And then the question is, how much can one trust the detailed predictions given that there are a large number of badly known parameters? I mean, perhaps heuristic educated estimates are better. This is a question. And like this question again, Subrat asks, I mean, like how good were these computations that Imperial College made? And what would have happened if UK chose a different path? So the only country I know is which hasn't imposed like strong measures is Sweden, and it hasn't done too badly probably, but I think it's like its neighbors have done kind of better at controlling deaths and so on. So okay, so finally I just want to say that disease forecasting, I mean, one can imagine that there's a like just like we have news weather forecasting, we can this is something that appears on TV, but it looks difficult at the moment, but certainly this should be something that we should pursue. And probably one can compare with like progress in weather forecasting and climate modeling, which at early stages was very ad hoc, but now it's really improved to quite precision. So thanks.
Okay, so
Thank you,
let's thank Abhishek.
Yeah, thank you, Abhishek. Very nice talk. Very informative.
There was already a lively discussion during the talk and several questions. But I think we can still take a few more minutes if Abhishek is okay with that to ask a few more questions.
I have a comment. This is Rajesh from IISc.
Yeah.
Can I go ahead with my comment? So this is with reference to the were the Imperial College computations and predictions on mitigation strategies accurate? So I think they've been building this model since early 2000 or so. There was a 2008 paper which basically compared 3 universities model. One of them was Imperial College model. The other one was the Virginia Biocomplexity Institute, and the third one was University of Washington's model. All 3 were agent-based models. The IHME model that I think you indicated is probably, I'm not sure to what extent they use the agent-based model, but the comparisons that it was a comparative study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2008. And so the 3 models were predicting on some past influenza infections, and they seem to be doing, they differed in their estimates, but they were reasonably close to each other. So as far as the framework is concerned, I think one can say that they're model is perhaps correct. With respect to the parameters, that's what they had to fit for this particular disease. So I think there are now some other agent-based simulators which seem to predict similar numbers. There's one from the Oxford University. The Virginia Biocomplexity Institute also has one. All of them seem to predict similar numbers. I mean, they are probably off by a factor of 2 or half or something like that, but they roughly predict similar numbers. So I think to some extent, at least to the given the parameters that they have used for their simulators, which they have advertised well in their work, it seems to be reasonably correct.
So, sorry, I also have a comment on this actually, on this same issue. I think that we actually do have data on how this model worked in Sweden. If I am, please correct me if I'm wrong. If I understand, some people from Uppsala University actually ran the Imperial College model for Sweden, and in March, and we now have data, and they seem to be off by factors of 20 or 30.
The question is not about whether it is off or not, but are they faithful to the model parameters? There are, I think, still quite a few parameters which are unknown. For example, asymptomatic fraction. Asymptomatic transmission itself, whether it happens or not, is unclear. If you look at asymptomatic fraction, there is wide variation between 20% and 60%. So I think if you change these numbers, the factors will be quite off.
Thank you. But then that brings us back to the original question. You see, if you have a very large number of parameters, you can basically get any numbers you like. And whenever I give you past data, I can always adjust my parameters to fit it. So, I mean, if we come back to the question here, what is the value of models in terms of understanding and predicting if so many of the parameters that go in are unknown and you can get any value you like by altering them?
With Abhishek's permission, may I venture an answer?
Yes, please. Yes.
So I think the way I view these models is you shouldn't look at them for the predictions that they make in terms of absolute numbers. But I think you can look at them and value them in terms of comparisons. So for example, if you had chosen, let's say, path A versus path B, the absolute numbers may be widely off, but that A is better than B might be a more reliable conclusion that you can make from a study of these models.
Sorry, but this is precisely what they tried to do in Sweden, right? They said that in Sweden, a hard lockdown is necessary because otherwise there would be 40,000 deaths a day. And if that number is now going to be off by a factor of 20, then you can't even make qualitative comparisons, right? If the absolute numbers are so far off. As you say, it may be that, yeah.
The hard lockdown and the non-hard lockdown numbers will be based on the same parameters. Yes, I think the numbers may be very large and the answer may be different when it is 1 lakh versus when it is 10,000. So I agree. But at least you will have a, whether A is better than B, that you can get from these models.
But I had a question. These parameters that you put into the model, why are they so, uncertain? In the sense that can't you extract them from the data that's already there? Get reasonable idea of what parameters you ought to be using?
No, so like, for example, this parameter, no, so how do you, let's say the factor gamma, this period, okay, so first of all, I think all this have distributions, okay, so this gamma is like how long do you stay infectious. So the only data that you have directly is all these numbers, new cases and so on. And then there is some, like if you just do contact tracing and all, you can get some more information which might tell you, but then it's, but just from the data of like number of cases, deaths and all, you can fit in many ways to
No, not from that data, but once now, at least in India, I thought the contact, but I guess they don't publicize the contact tracing data, is that correct? Or like maybe at least the modeler should have access to that data in terms of numbers.
Okay, this maybe Rajesh might know better.
So I think there is ICMR. I don't know whether they release the data, but Karnataka does. And in Karnataka, the numbers are actually quite low. So we are unable to get reliable estimates on these parameters. So for example, if we assume asymptomatic transmission is there, then we get somewhat differing estimates of the period for which someone is symptomatic versus when we don't assume. So I think there isn't enough data for Karnataka, which is a fortunate thing for us. I don't know with respect to the other cities.
No, but in principle, if there is enough testing and contact tracing, then that data will actually give you information about even this asymptomatic transmission, right? Because somebody was tested, found positive, but without, I mean, like, you know, if that data, when somebody tested positive, but whether they are symptomatic, that data in principle should be there, right? And then through contact tracing, you also know whether, you know, how many other people that they had come into contact were affected and so on. So in principle, you can get some idea of the probability with which they infect. No?
Yes, to some extent it is there, but if you look at some direct data, this is, for example, the Diamond Princess cruise ship. Basically, the there they tested pretty much everybody, and then about 700 tested positive, but about 60%, 59% or so were asymptomatic. But then when they did a similar test on people that returned from Wuhan, these were Japanese that returned from Wuhan, returned back to Japan. They did a test on them, and there it was 33%, the asymptomatic fraction. And then some other test in Italy, a place called Vo, there it was 45%. So I think it seems to be varying quite a bit. And so when you're modeling, there are all these possibilities, and it's not clear how to take this and fit. So these are reliable data. All of these have been tested, but some of it is actually based also on questions that you ask. Did you ever cough? Did you do this? And things like that. And because of the long incubation period, maybe there is some misrepresentation of what exactly happened. It's not clear. So I think these are some issues that I see. I'm not giving a good answer to your question. Data should be available. We should have a better answer now, but somehow it is still uncertain as far as these questions are concerned. Asymptomatic fraction.
No, maybe there may be another thing, which is another level of intervention from the scientists to the government, is in terms of guiding them about what kind of data to collect, so that it will give you better values for your parameters, you know. Because after all, the people who collect the data, you know, need to be probably educated or informed or whatever as to what questions to ask, what to look for, what observations to make in order to guide you to get better parameters.
And also who to test, where to test, and things like that.
All that, yeah.
So sorry for saying that again, but I mean, as Abhishek knows, my feeling is that this issue of parameters, the assumption is somehow that we've got the science correct, you know, and then we are trying to fit parameters correctly. But it's not clear to me that the SEIR model gets the science correct at all. I mean, for instance, the idea that there's a well-mixed population, these things, because these things are wrong, it's not, you know, what I'm worried about is we can always use the data and fit a model very nicely with enough number of parameters, and agent-based models have even more. But it's still not clear how the data is meaningful. I mean, as Abhishek knows, one of the things we were discussing was the data from Iceland, which actually did a very large number of tests. And you can fit it very beautifully with an SEIR model. But the epidemiological numbers it gives you are rubbish. It tells you that, you know, transmission happens in 1/4 of a day, and these you know, time from infection to recovery is similarly very short. But if you just put in those parameters into an SEIR model, you'll get a beautiful fit. So I mean, the question is, I feel before we talk about fitting parameters, have we got the science right? And it's not clear that the modeling is getting
you don't have to stick to the SEIR model, right? You can do like
But then you have even more trouble, right? Because now if you go to agent-based models, now you have hundreds of parameters, because every agent comes with...
Right, and even within these compartment-based models, the more compartments you introduce, right, the more parameters you have to put into your model.
Exactly.
And so the greater the uncertainty. So, for instance, one of these, I forget, it's this big consortium of physicists and other people who've been doing this modeling, and I think they have a compartment-based model in which they have 8 or 9 compartments. Okay, you have 4. They have more than twice that number, right? They have things like, how many people are symptomatic and hospitalized but not critical, how many of them are critical but not dead, and so they have all of these things, and with each additional compartment that they introduce, there's probably 3 or 4 extra parameters that they need to put into the model, and then of course it's just a mess, because you have some 20 parameters in your model, and right, and then you can sort of as Suvrat was saying, fit to anything that you like with multiple combinations of those parameters.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, so in that case, one strategy is to look for like things which are kind of robust, right? I mean, for example, here, I mean, even if though we have like 8, like we have 8 parameters, but many of the parameters don't are like kind of benign. I mean, you can like if you just know R naught, like a lot of things can be predicted. So I mean, one should look for like sort of robust.
But Abhishek, so
that is
this
one
is
idea. But also, I
right.
think eventually, I mean, this kind of detailed models, like I mean, right now maybe they are not sufficiently developed, but in principle, I think the science is like this. I don't agree with Suvrat that this we don't know the science. The science we know, but it's just too many. It's similar to where like climate, right? I mean, it's like hugely complicated, but we are learning more and more. So I would just
I mean, we know the science in some sense, but the science that we are putting into the model or the agent-based model is not accurate, right? It's because there are too many parameters for the real science. So we put in some simplification.
If I may venture a comment there. So there are actually, for the agent-based models at least, there are 2 things that can be separated. There is actually a biology model, and then there is an interaction model. So I think for the biology model, yes, there are many parameters. Like, for example, what's the asymptomatic fraction? How long is the, what distribution do you put for the incubation period? There are many models, many parameters there. I think there are many studies. I think the Chinese, the English, the Italians, many have come up with studies that have estimated these parameters. And there is quite a bit of variance as well. But I think to some extent, you can separate out this biology from the other social aspects, which is the interaction aspects. And I think once you do this separation, if you look at the actual connection parameters, there are very few. So if you get the biology right, or at least to some extent, and if you have some information about the contacts based on how people are traveling, how people are interacting with each other, then I feel that you can get a good model together.
So, sorry, just to ask on that, isn't it true that the social part has even more parameters? Because in the model you have a school and you have a workplace. So there's a question of how much time people spend on a transport, how much time they spend in the workplace, how much time they interact with each other. So I mean, it seems that there are hundreds of parameters even in the social setup. Isn't that true?
Yes, of course. I think there are many parameters that you have to fit. But most of, I mean, we just instantiate a city, for example, in the agent-based model, based on some course information that is provided on the school size, school distribution, workplace distribution, commute distances, and so on. So, if your point is that you have 100,000 variables, so how can I believe this? I think I see your point, but I also think that the final tuned parameters that you have are very few, which are just the the betas that Abhishek spoke about. So I think from that perspective, it's small.
Also relevant. I mean, how many people you interact with in public transport, and how many people travel by first class, and how many travel by second class in Mumbai locals. All of them are also relevant, no, in model. And what?
It depends on what you're using the model for. Once again, so I think if you're using it to predict exact numbers, all these things will matter. If you're using it only to compare A versus B, I don't think it matters.
Sorry for interrupting, but maybe we can give some time for questions from non-experts because we're running a bit late.
Hi there. I'm Kirti. I'm a student at IISc. I would like to ask a question.
Please go ahead.
Yeah.
You were talking about a parameter wherein you said the social interaction when you are in a bus or while you're traveling, when you're eating. But since the regulations like wearing a mask, keeping a distance with the population you are with, so will that matter? That interaction will matter even if we are saying there are no interventions, because we are keeping our mask on, and I'm assuming that this is through only droplet infection. I mean, this communicates through droplets. So, how will it affect?
Right. So I guess one is like and both of them go into this parameter beta. One is like if you wear masks or wash hands with like soap and all, you are probably decreasing the probability of transmission. And but finally this factor beta depends on the probability of transmission and then the number of people you come in contact, right? So I think, of course, this transmission, it's not completely known how it's like through drops and all, but also through touch, like you touch something and then maybe through just that. So it's a complicated thing, but both of this will affect this parameter beta, like just wearing masks. So that's certainly important, and washing hands, and then also you need to reduce, increase distances.
Okay. Okay.
There's a question from Anupam Ghosh, whose microphone is malfunctioning. So he's saying people, like similar to the previous question, like people wearing masks in public after this lockdown eases may lead to a similar value of R0 as considered in the modeling currently. That is 1.1 or whatever. So R0 value might not be as big as pre-lockdown value since masks are being made mandatory and other interventions by the state are putting in new measures. This is the question by Anupam Ghosh.
Sorry, so the question is whether wearing masks decreases or not.
No, so the assumption that the R0 value will return to the pre-lockdown value if the lockdown is eased might not be correct because there are new systems in place.
That's true, right? Because that's absolutely correct. Like people will be much more careful, right? So it should be like all this should be enforced, that people wear masks and people are more careful about hygiene and and many things will become impractical. Like how can you avoid if you return to normal? Like if you look at Mumbai trains, how can you avoid that? Like the huge contact that people have. But you can only partially reduce it now. How much exactly this mask is important? The contribution, that's difficult to estimate, I would say.
I can give some specific numbers based on some cohort studies. These were one-sided cohort studies in the sense that only the group that was wearing masks was tracked. And in this particular group, the estimated reduction in the beta was 0.22. That is, the beta went down by about 22%. But then there is some uncertainty window around it. It's only an estimated number, and the uncertainty window is quite large. So it could be, for example, something which is the 22%. There's a plus minus which is quite large, which is, I think, perhaps why WHO and others maybe initially said that masks may not be that important a factor. But the estimated number is this. But this is for people who are, this is in past influenza illness studies. But if you look at those who actually have influenza, if they wear masks, apparently there is no specific number that I have come across, but it's supposed to be more effective than the 22%.
Okay.
Hello. Abhishek, this is Rajesh. Can I ask a question from messages? Hi, very nice talk and very informative. I had a sort of naive question as a non-expert who has not studied this, but could it be that there is some intermediate scale at which the simple SCIR models work optimally? Probably it might be not so good to apply it at the 100 million population level. It might work at a 10 million population level. It may not work at a 1 million or a few 100,000 population level because of fluctuations. It might not work at a very high scale because too many more, I mean, there are inhomogeneities and you're kind of washing over many other this thing. So like for instance, in India, maybe instead of applying it to India as a whole, identify either states or cities or some combinations where these have a better chance of giving a little bit more of an accurate picture. Is that something people have looked at as maybe, because you showed in Europe different things and they kind of collapse to things roughly, but then each of those European things is roughly like a state in India. Yeah, but in any case, the broader question is that of scale dependence, whether there is a place where there is an optimal perhaps behavior.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I think this is something we have been thinking also. Like it should definitely hold better in a city like Bangalore if it's applied where with a population of 10 million. Which is more mixed than the entire country, right? That's definitely true. So, I mean, yeah, so that's definitely true. And one interesting question would be to how, I mean, so of course one can just look at the data in places like, let's say, New York City and smaller countries like Belgium and all. So this is something that we have been doing, and which are like very small and much more homogeneous, and it works there. And then the question is like, if there's a collection of such small with some distribution of populations, then how does that show up in the overall data? So that's I think interesting question. But that's definitely true that for a population maybe 1 to 10 million it works better. And in a city, right? Even in as opposed to Karnataka, it should work better in Bangalore.
Yeah. But this sort of thing is not looked at very much anywhere else, not just in India, I mean, anywhere else.
So like most of the studies I've seen is like for countries like in Italy or in specific countries. But in a big country, how the individual things patch up to give the overall thing? Is that your question? I mean,
yeah, that would be a follow-up of it. But just to get an instance of where, roughly where these models, you can try to feel that what are the situations where these models work best. I mean, as people have been discussing, I think once you introduce more parameters, it is this thing. But the crude model, which has just two parameters, beta and gamma, in a way, I would, if there is it would be, that would be the one which I would place my hopes most on. But the question is, it may not be universally applicable, but it may be applicable in some context or scale. And if one can identify that context or scale where it is best applicable, that may give you then a starting point. And if maybe one can even quantitatively say that this model will fail if you push it, you try to apply it at say 1 billion level, or if you try to apply it at a few 100,000 level. And if certain other parameters like mixing and so on are not are not enough.
I mean, so we tried this, and one difficulty we had was, okay, so of course every country, like if you look at, let's say, New York City, I mean, the final data that you see, I mean, if you want to fit it to predictions from a SIR model, then it's important, of course, that you put in the correct way interventions were introduced, right? So, I mean, because this is not the result of a free model. So interventions, of course, happened in a complicated way. Like maybe at some time you introduce what you officially call lockdown, but even earlier you were probably already doing something. So so you don't
the
know
parameters
exactly
themselves are time dependent in some sense.
Right. Yeah. So you have to put in some time dependence, and then okay, one can fit the data, of course, like by putting in some form of but now, of course, if this it will be different in different countries, so then this doesn't give you any predictive power, I think. That's
so
one. But
one place where these models do work well, and I think my impression just from looking at studies is that that's where a lot of them have been studied and originated. You know, you might look at a place like a boarding school where an epidemic breaks out and then, you know, goes to chicken pox or influenza epidemic breaks out. And in those settings, I think these models work well because all the assumptions are met.
No,
you know,
so of course, like these models are also used for like animal farms and all, where it works really
exactly. Well. So then maybe in those settings they work well, and then
because there is like you know the control also very well.
Right. So populations of 1,000 and so on, they already work well.
But okay, but there's also this interesting story. So this Neil Ferguson, who's involved in this Imperial College study. I mean, he was also like, I think 2000 something when this mad cow disease and all things were going on. Like his model was used to take a decision on like culling a million cattle or something. So, and that was, I think also there were questions whether it was the right decision or not. So even in simpler settings, of course, again, it was a more complicated model. I'm not sure what exactly the model was. But even there, it's not always simple. But I think this is something worth trying, like just looking at small populations, I mean, and seeing how well, because there is the maximum chance it will work.
Yeah, and cities, again, I mean, there are mixing, so one has to sort of probably try to be a little judicious, maybe which are the cities where a lot of the population is substantially meeting each other. So yeah, New York City, maybe it is there, or some boroughs within the New York City, etc. So I think, yeah, the question is I think if one can identify many local populations, then one can get an idea whether the betas and gammas that come out of these local populations are perhaps sensible values, and whether there's a pattern in the values of betas and gammas that you come out with in small populations. If one can see a systematics of them, and again, then of course, if necessary, time dependence depending on this thing, but perhaps some of these can be initially modeled by some step functions. So yeah, I would think that it's more like an art, I guess. It's not then this thing of trying to find which is the this thing. So anyhow, yeah, I mean, just naive thoughts of an outsider.
Okay. Are there any more questions?
Okay. Can I make one comment? I think
please.
Abhishek's one of the last slides did not show ICMR and other epidemiologists in India in good light. So I would like to point out.
Still watching Big Bang Theory.
So there is actually, there are a couple of ICMR papers published in IJMR, Indian Journal of Medical Research. So I think one of them is an SEIR model with compartments, but the compartments involves migration across cities and air traffic and train traffic and things like that, but modeled in an appropriate way. And then there is AFMC has put out a few researchers also based on SCAR model and also lockdown analysis, but that is in the Armed Forces journal. So I think somehow NCBS had access to this and they shared it with us. So I think there are some works from other epidemiologists and ICMR as well.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, on that positive note, let's thank Abhishek and in particular also Surat, Rajesh, Sandeep and Subroto and the other experts who gave their valuable comments, and hope you all stay safe.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.